All right, well, welcome to the Redlands Camera Club. This is an editing tutorial. My name is Bruce Herwig, and I'm going to be talking about star trails and Milky Way. Basically, the idea here is I'm going to jump into Lightroom and the various Photoshop and the various programs that I use and walk you through how I would go about editing a picture. So as you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I know there's sometimes a delay on the Zoom meeting, so if I'm going too fast and you need me to go backwards, go ahead and unmute yourself and come back in. This is a star trail image here. This is actually one of the very first star trail images that I ever took back in 2015. And North Star is here. And I didn't actually know at the time that I was shooting the North Star, but as the Earth rotates, all of the everything moves around the poles, and that's the North Pole there. Everything moves around that pole, and you get the illusion of star trails. Now, what's really happening is you're taking a picture, as we talked about last week. You're taking one picture, and the Earth moves, and you're taking another picture, and another picture, and another picture. And as these string together, that's what's giving the trails. And that's just giving the illusion. In the olden days with film, you could leave doing a long exposure, and Frank, you could speak to this, you would get some nice, long, very smooth star trails. And I think people would open it up, they would open up their film cameras for multiple hours, and you could make their own star trails that way. Clear drawings, clear. So when I'm using star trails, close that. This is my batch of pictures. And I'm going to open this up. And for star trails, it's really just one, you're just taking a picture of the night sky. And then you're taking another picture of the night sky. And if you could see, as I'm walking through, there's some animation that's happening as the stars are moving through the night sky. They're barely moving one at a time. And again, when we're going to combine those together. There's a couple of ways to build your star trails, and I'm going to talk about two ways to build your star trails. One is with an external program. It's a free program called Star Stacks. And the other program that we all know and love is Photoshop. So I'm going to jump on here. This is my the programs that I use. Stellarium, we talked about last week. That's what I use to plan my Milky Way shots in terms of trying to figure out when and where and how high and what time the Milky Way is going to be. Star Trails is one program to make star trails in. Star Stacks is the one I'm going to show you tonight. And the technique here, it can be used with 20 photos or 1,000 photos. There's no cap on what you can do, but just for time's sake, I'm going to enter about 40 photos, or just an amount, so it doesn't take all night for us to edit. Before I run this, there is whether you're going to be running RAW files, TIFF files, or JPEG files. And I find that it's with star trails, you don't need the raw data. So first you would edit your photos in Lightroom, brighten them up, darken them up, add whatever it is that you're going to do. Then export them out as JPEGs. And if you can then work with your JPEGs, the rest of the post-processing works just fine. When we get to Photoshop, I have done it with raw files, before, and we'll talk about some of the pluses and minuses when I get there. Open images. Here are the pictures, and I said I'm just going to take a certain number, and I'm just going to add those images. And the images are in star stacks. And over on the right here, there are some blending modes. We're just going to use, I'm using a 4K monitor, so my pull-down menus are pretty tiny. We're just going to use the default, which is lighten. And then I'm going to say go. And what you'll watch in real time, it's adding one image right on top of the other. And it's going to be, and it's just going down. Oh, we got a airplane trail there. So this is just the files right out of the, oh, that was a meteor that just went by. No, lots of airplane trails. And this one. Okay, so 66 images processed. And there you have it. You have a star trail image. Now, this isn't probably what you're going to want to show everybody, but I have found that sometimes showing all the air traffic can be very interesting to people. They don't realize how busy the night skies are. They're virtual highways in the sky. So let me hit pause here, and if somebody has a question or a comment, go ahead and ask it. Anyone?
How do you get rid of the plane tracks and so forth?
Yes, we're going to talk about that. There is the rub of star trails. Star trails, you know, the last star trail I did, it was 2 hours to drive to the dark location, 2 hours to shoot the dark location, 2 hours to drive back to the dark location, and then 6 hours to edit everything, all the star trails out. So all depends on how detailed you want to get on this. I'm going to go ahead and close star stacks here. I'm going to jump to my images. These are the same images. So there's a couple ways to go about it. One is to use the heel brush. So I can open up an image, and you could do this one by one. You can open it up as a stack. I'm going to just open one image here and open. Somebody needs to mute themselves. Edit, open with Photoshop. Thank you. Opening up the image in Photoshop. And there's two ways to go about fixing the star trails. But you have to go, there's no magic way to do it. You have to go image by image. And so this is where the time and the process comes. And depending on how dark your skies are, you not only will have airplanes, but sometimes you'll have satellite images that you're going to have to take out. In fact, they just Elon Musk launched a new batch of satellites, and they were messing up my photos on Saturday. Pretty good. Okay. So two ways to go about this. Here's my airplane trail, and I need to remove that. Step one, I could take a black pen, and you don't have to be too picky on how big your black pen is, but I can hit shift there, make sure that I'm actually black, shift, go, and then save the image. And then I can open up the next image and do the same thing. The next image and do the same thing. Save this. So that's one way to do it. The other way is to use the heel brush. And that one gives you a little bit cleaner view, and that will clean it up. Now the problem with the heel brush is it's taking the stars that are around it and kind of pushing them back into place. So you don't want to use a real thick, you don't want to use a thick brush. You want to make it as thin as possible to make sure that you're getting, that you're cleaning up those star trail images. And so when you have those saved, and I'm going back to my folder here. So notice I have my JPEG export folder. That's just as the files were taken, exported from Lightroom. Then I have a heal folder. So everything in here was, I used the heal tool because I was experimenting at the time. This was JPEGs, and these were all used, this was all cleaned up using the black lime technique here. And I was trying to figure out which method was better. And you'll have to be the judge of that. Now I'm going to go back into Star Stacks. Open that up. Star Stacks, actually, they have it's free, and they have a version for the Mac and for the PC. So this, I usually will use this program, especially early on. Especially early on when I'm just trying to figure out what did I get in the night. This is one of the fastest ways. I could just import them, run them through Star Stacks. I don't have to worry, I don't worry about getting any of the airplanes out. I just want to see, did I have a good night or not, to know how detailed. So I'm going to use the healed items in here. I'm going to select a number, open those up, and lighten is the default, and I'm going to run that. And again, depending on how large your JPEGs are, this will also run TIFFs. It won't run RAW files, but it will run TIFF files. And if you took black images or dark images, you can run those in through there, and that'll help you clean things up as well. So it's moving, it's processing. You can see there's a meteor here, which it caught. And that would be my final image. And then I could take that into Photoshop and process that. Here's another neat thing with Star Stacks, is it has a comment mode. And I'm just going to take those exact same images, and I'm going to run them. And it's actually going to process them a little bit differently. I think you could see that. I guess the screen hasn't caught up yet. I just love watching these things build. There we go. You can see that it added, it has a little bit different look to it. So notice how this, it's thinner on the bottom and it's thicker as it goes up. So I can make them longer. There's some settings over here. I can also process the images in reverse order. And so that will make, instead of going from, this looks like it's wheeling to the right from the bottom left to the bottom right. I'm going to run that again. And it's going to run it in the opposite order. While this is running, I'm going to get a battery for my iPad. I'll be right back. And as you can see, it ran the comments in the opposite direction. So what questions do you have about this process?
Bruce, I'm a little confused. Your initial exposures, were they just a standard night sky exposure, like 20 seconds or so? Or did you expose them for longer to get them to streak?
You're taking, I'm going to go back to the original image. I'm just taking a single picture of the stars. So the initial settings that we had talked about last week is for star trails, maybe something like f4, ISO 1600 for 30 seconds. So you're just taking pictures of the stars.
Bruce, can you repeat the question? I didn't hear it.
Sure. The question was, how do you get them to streak? Well, you're not actually making your pictures that you're taking here aren't streaking. The pictures of the stars are just pinpoint stars. And so you're just taking a lot of them. And so you're taking one picture after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. And what that's going to do is when you put them all together, it's going to show the streaking. Does that answer your question?
Bruce, how many images did you take that night of the exposure that you did on the images for these?
On that night, typically I'll do an hour to 2 hours. So in terms of the number of exposures, if you're taking 2 pictures a minute, each one is at 30 seconds. In an hour, you're going to have 120 images. Now, depending on where you are and which way you're facing, which part of the country you're in, you may have 119 of those with airplane trails in them. we live in a very, especially if you're going to the closer to LA you go to. Right now with COVID-19, there's a fewer amount of air traffic, so now's a good time to, if you dare venture out, to do that. So the images themselves are just single pictures. Go ahead.
I have a question. So what did you hit when after you imported to Star Stacks, what did you hit to blend them?
Oh, I hit the go button.
Just go?
There's a, do I still have the program open? Yep. Up here, it says start process. That's what I clicked. It's the start process button.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, Bruce, I've got a question real quick.
Go ahead.
Just a clarification. You shot them in RAW and then converted them after you processed them in Lightroom to JPEGs. Is that correct?
Barry, that's exactly what I did. I shot them in RAW. I edited the photos the way that I wanted to. I got I added my clarity or my dehazing or my exposure adjustments. Then you clone those settings all the way through that batch, and then you export them out as JPEGs. You can export them out as TIFFs as well if you like the higher process. Just the files are that much larger. And I find with Star Trails, you don't necessarily need all that color depth. Any other questions before I jump into Photoshop?
Did you just take them in the first place as JPEG?
You could just take them in the first place as JPEGs. In fact, these, when I first started and wasn't confident in shooting in RAW, everything that I shot was in JPEG. So that's all you have to work with. So yes, there's not necessarily that much benefit when you're shooting Star Trails, is what I found.
Bruce, what's the yellow dot in the upper right?
Oh, I don't think I cleared it from an annotation. Is it, did that clear it out? Or let the computer video screen catch up? Did that go away there for you? Yep, that was just a bad annotation. So let me draw on the screen here. So this here, actually, you could see in the circle, I guess you can't see in the circle, there is a delay on this. That is actually a meteor. And that's a real meteor. opposed to the fake meteors, as we talked about last week. It wasn't a star trail or a satellite lens flare. It wasn't. It was actually, we were shooting the Perseids, and so it was a real live meteor, and which was fun to have captured. So I'm going to clear all the drawings there. Okay, and now we're going to do the same process in Photoshop. Because many times we're in Photoshop already, we might as well stay there. So this is where you go to File, and we're going to batch import these. I'm going to go to, it's a script, and I'm going to load the files into a stack. And that's going to load all of those images. Again, the bigger, the more images you have, the harder it gets. So I'm going to browse. And these are the JPEG edited photos. I'm going to come down. We're going to select some. Fortunately, JPEGs don't take long to load. Everything is just faster when you're working with the JPEGs. So those are loaded. And I don't need to, I'm not focus stacking, so I don't have to try to align these things. If you did your tripod right and you didn't bump it during the night, you should be good to go. So all I have to say is okay. And it's going to load them one at a time. And you might think, oh boy, I'll save some time and I'll save this stack so I'll have it for future reference. And what you're going to find is, 60, 120, 240 images. That's a big file. So you may run into the cap that Photoshop has. Now, fortunately, they have a way around it. And John Williams, I forget what the file format is called. It's something like Photoshop really big file image. You know what I'm talking about, John? I would look it up, but I'm importing images right now.
It's large document something or other.
There you go, large document format. And your little Save As pull-down menu, it'll show, it's the second one down, but it'll allow you to save much larger files. You don't have the same flexibility in terms of sending them to a print shop or anything like that. Okay, so your files are now loaded. They're in Photoshop. And you can see here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hide some of these images. All I'm doing is clicking on the little eyeball tool. And if I was having to edit these, I would just go one by one by one, find the image, draw my black line on it, or use the heal tool, hide it, go down to the next one, draw my black line, or use the heal tool, and go down, 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 one by one. And what you're going to find is the darker the skies, the more things you'll see. And especially when you have, it's much easier if you're shooting against rocks, because you can't see the playing trails behind rocks. But these trees down in here, these can get very, very tricky. And so all we have to do here is I'm going to view all my images, and I'm going to select all my images. So I'm holding down the Shift key. I have the top one selected. I'm going to the bottom, and every image is selected here. Then I'm going to change my blend mode, and I'm just going to go down to lighten. This is interesting. You can see where this is dark in here, and you can see where all those airplane trails were. Multiply. Well, that's totally black. That's not good. I always find this fascinating to just go through these, each one, and kind of see what effect that it gives you. And so I'm going to go down to lighten. And does that look familiar? We did the same thing that Star Stacks did right here in Photoshop, but we didn't have to leave. Now, one of my favorite techniques is you take the top image of your stack and you change that blending mode to hard light here. And I think that that just is a beautiful, a beautiful change, a beautiful image. I'm going to zoom in on that. You can see that. I'm going to change it to hard light. It gives just a nice effect to your star trails that you can't get using Star Stacks. You can also change it to pin light. That's a lot lighter. Let me come back it up, change this top one to pin light. And I think that is just a fun way to mix up your star trails. Let me pause here and answer any questions about star trails. Again, your camera settings. Let's see if I can annotate here. I'm going to annotate. Annotate. Good. Your camera settings are F4. Your ISO is 1600. And your seconds is 30. Now, some people get away. They actually drop their ISO to 800 and then move their seconds to 60. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Carolyn, can you go ahead and mute yourself? Good to see you, but you're making some noise there. But if you use the that way you have half the amount of star trails to edit and to blend, which is an interesting idea. I haven't tried that technique. I typically am taking, usually I'm trying to catch a meteor. And so you set your intervalometer you set your intervalometer to every 30 seconds and it just is going and going and going. It's just going to take those pictures for you. All right, so if that's if no questions on star trails, I'm going to jump into the Milky Way if that's all right.
One more question, Bruce. On when you set your blend mode, did you set it for all the images to lighten?
That's correct. I'm going to stop there.
And then just the first one you set to pen light or hard light. Okay.
Yep, so if I take everything and I go to lighten, that's going to give me my star trail image. Can everybody see my screen still?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, so that's just is going to give you, if you want a, hi Carolyn, good to see you.
Hi.
Can you go ahead and hit mute for me?
Sure.
And then if you have any questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Bruce?
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, earlier you made a comment about rocks not having problems with trees might give you issues. What sort of issues are you referring to and how do you address those?
Got it. I'm going to say no to this image here, and I'm going to come down to, I'm going to come back to my unedited images. What you'll find is that when you're taking pictures in with pine trees, that the airplane trails go through, let me see which way they're going to go here. The airplane was flying away from me. So I'm going to go back the other way. So here's exactly what I'm talking about, where in terms of it can be tricky. Going to zoom in for me. Right down over here. Where the images, where the airplanes are going through the trees. Now, if it was a nice solid rock, you wouldn't see that. You also, if you're shooting on a windy day, so those trees are moving all around. So if you take the editing technique is the same, but sometimes, and I'm sorry I don't have an example here, but the images, if your airplanes are on a flight path, they could be much farther away. And so I find that it takes me 2 to 3 times to go through all of my images one by one. Then I'll run I'll edit all the images where I think that I've edited them. I'll either run them, I'll use lighten mode in Photoshop, and then I'll find out, you know what, there's a whole batch that I missed that I couldn't see one by one because the airplane was so small, the trail was so thin that I couldn't necessarily see it. And so I have to go back and edit again. And of course, you don't know where those images are. In a stack of 240 or 120, you don't know where it is. So it's finding the needle in a haystack. So that's where you have to go down. You unhide all the images in Photoshop using using the eyeball tool. The eyeball tool there. If you click on the eyeball tool, it'll hide an image. And so when you're hiding that image, you can see the next one below it. Another challenge that I find is that if I'm looking in one area of the screen, I'll find the images here in the bottom left, but then I'll go up in the upper right, and then there's another batch of airplane trails somewhere else. And of course, where are those? I don't know where those are, so I have to go back. And so it's a very tedious process. But I think the end results are absolutely totally worth it. Any other questions on Star Trails? They're relatively easy. Let me kind of make this comment before I move on. In astrophotography, there are several steps and layers. So if you're talking about moon photography, that's on level 1. Moon photography is a level 1 activity. Stars and star trails, star trails, let's call that a level 2. Milky Way, maybe that's a level 3. And some people think if you shoot the Milky Way, all of a sudden now you are some hot stuff. Well, there's whole other staircases on this upper level, in terms of tracking and stacking, in terms of doing shooting telescopes, and those things are all up here when you're using broadband, using astro modified cameras. Those are all way up here. So we're talking about the shallow end of the pool over on this end. You can, again, because the higher, the more difficult you go, it's more money. You got to have you have to have the right tools, and you also have to have the right equipment. Equipment, and you also have a lot of time. when I shoot the Milky Way, my shots are, I'm taking, I'll shoot for the night, which is awesome. 3 or 4 hours. I'll get, when I'm really motivated, I'll take, 30 shots of the Milky Way, and I'll blend them together, and it's very exciting. Some of these guys, they're shooting 30 hours of raw data over multiple nights using multiple bandwidths to get some of the nebula and some of the deep space objects. So just because you can shoot the moon doesn't mean you can shoot the other ones. It doesn't mean you can't eventually. It's just, it's a different process with a different technique. So I'm going to jump into Lightroom. Judith, this is one I shot yesterday. This was actually had a fun story to it. If you put, see these star flares on this astro image. It's the same one that I have that behind me in the picture. I heard that if you put dental floss in front of your camera, and here's what I mean by dental floss in front of your camera. I'm going to jump on to Facebook, because I have it here. That you could get some that you can get some star flares. It's like, well, that sounds like a weird idea, but one that I was interested in trying. Here we go. So if you put dental floss in front of your lens, and so I've just taped it there with, I wish I would say it was gaffer tape. I think this is just painter's tape. I just needed something to hold it in place for me to experiment with. You put that in front of the lens, and you get this neat effect with the brightest stars in your images. So that was kind of fun. Also wanted to show you here before we get going. This is with a 150 millimeter lens. This is the Rojo complex. It's my favorite part of the Milky Way. And this is what the images started off like. That is what the image started to look like when I was editing my images. This is the area of this final image over here. That
Bruce, you're not sharing your images with us.
Are they not coming through? Or Frank, are you the only one?
Getting
How about that? Can you see that?
Yeah, I can.
I can see it here.
Okay. There may be a delay on your end, Frank.
Okay.
Can you see the Rojo complex there?
No, I see you.
Oh, you see me. Are you using an iPad or what?
I'm using a PC.
PC. Okay. Can anybody jump in here and help Frank? I know there's a view that you can look
I'm
at.
viewing it on my Apple.
I'm getting it on my PC, but I'm not sure I can help you.
Okay. So Frank, see if there's a look at the shared presentation. You may be looking at me as the speaker. Or
That's
you may
definitely what I'm seeing.
Okay. Were you seeing the images before, Frank?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to suggest you leave the meeting and then jump right back in. I think that'll just, when in doubt, reboot. I think if you leave and jump back in, that'll shake it up for you.
Okay, I see a view options up at the top. Let's see.
That may do it.
Now I'm seeing your image. Thank you.
There you go. Okay, so let me go back to the image before. So this is the raw file, and this is the processed file. And as you can see, there's a big difference between the two. And so a lot of people, it's very similar to when you're shooting the Milky Way itself. You don't actually necessarily see the Milky Way in your, with the naked eye. You can sometimes see that there's something there, but you see, it's this milky part of the galaxy. But here's a raw file that I took of the Milky Way. It's laying on its side, and here's just with just pulling up the clarity and dehazing a little bit. Now you can start to see something that's something is in here. Here's the core. So this is fully processed. So if you're taking pictures of the Milky Way and your images don't come right out of the camera raw perfectly, that's normal. Don't be concerned. Don't be concerned with that. The data is there. You just have to tease it out. You have to tease it out. So I'm going to go over here to the end. So here was different compositions that I was working with. Landscape. Rick and I, we went to the cotton tree exit of Joshua Tree, and north it was closed. So we decided to go south along the Box Canyon highway there, down to the Salton Sea, but that was closed. But then we decided, hey, that's closed. We had the whole road to ourselves, and so we started to use that as our foreground, as a foreground element. And so this was different composition that I was trying. You could see over here, this is a Jupiter showing up there. So trying different compositions, moving it around. Then I'll go ahead and stack my images. I'm gonna show you how to do it both stacked and not stacked. This was, we were lighting up the foreground. So I had an LED panel and we were lighting up the foreground. You shoot the foreground different than you shoot the background, just like most things. With night photography, if you're shooting at 6400 ISO for the Milky Way, that your camera is very light sensitive, and so you have to use different images for the stars. Well, let's see if I can get down here. I'm going to select. Okay. This is processed. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do this is the after. This is the after image. Let me let the screen catch up here. And so you can see the Milky Way pretty clearly here. This is the fun part that people, when people talk about Milky Way season, they're talking about shooting the core of the Milky Way. And that is this part in here. And that core is the brightest spot. And then there's these, if you do it well, there's some tendrils that come along here. And that part that I had showed you earlier, and again, I have a hard time pronouncing it, the Oho complex, something like that. That's this little part here that's circled here. But that's, if you're shooting the Milky Way, you want to make sure that you can get these tendrils here, and that you know that you've done a good job when you've shot that. So I'm going to go ahead and clear all of my settings here on this picture. So I'm going to reset it to blank. And so this is what my image look like straight out of the camera. Pretty flat, as you can see. Not a lot of contrast, not a lot of color. And so this is where you get to work. So before I jump in, does anybody have questions on shooting or Milky Way shooting?
Bruce, on one of them, you mentioned that you used a 150 millimeter lens. I would assume that you would have to go with a lot shorter exposure time. What did you use?
Actually, I was using my tracker when I was using that. And that was not what that was just for, I'm going to hit annotate here. I was shooting that piece of the Milky Way with a 150 millimeter lens. This image here was shot with a 24 millimeter lens. So I have a much wider, and you can see that here in my XF data. So this is actually pretty brutal. ISO 10,000, f4.0. There's not a lot of light getting into that image. In fact, it's so much. This was an experiment I was doing just to see how much data you can collect, and that's actually too little light. I did shoot the same thing with 2 point. Oh, here's just to give you an idea about where we were located. We set up right on the other side of all the road closed signs, which was nice. It was the best foreground image that we had was the road, and so we went ahead and used that. So here's the image here. This was shot at 2.8, so twice the amount of light. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to reset this image, and that's what we're going to use. All right, so here was my image. Pretty flat, not a lot of detail, but this is straight raw out of the camera. First thing I want to notice here, we were talking about those satellite images. You can see 3 of those right here in a row. These those white dashes, those are the new satellites that Musk was using. So those are now circling the Earth and getting in the way of my astrophotography. So I'll have to tell them to quit it. So first thing I like to do when I'm editing the Milky Way is I like to bring up the exposure, actually. I just am trying to see what detail is there. And you can, it's kind of like an X-ray. I can see, I'm going to use my annotation here. I can see the thin tendrils coming out. I can see the body of the Milky Way. I can see where the core is here. And in this case here, we have some clouds. Now we also have the road as my main image, as our main pieces of this image. In this case here, I'm not concerned at all with the bottom, with the road piece. We shot that separate. This is going to be a composite blend, so I'm going to not be concerned with the road. So in this case, I don't need any of the shadows. That was exposure. I do need the exposure. I don't need any of the shadows. So I can, there's not a lot of shadows. If you take a look at the sky here, it doesn't change too much when I pull the shadows down into what it does with the sky. But the ground, I don't care what's happening with the ground at all. I am going to also bring my highlights down. You'd think that you'd want to bring them up, but I actually bring them down, the highlights. And what that's going to do is flatten, give you a little bit more detail here, and more, it's going to even out the Milky Way here. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the noise. I do that pretty early on. And what I found is that Lightroom here in the noise section they already apply some noise reduction. When I bring the images in, they automatically apply some noise reduction. I'm going to take a look, and I'm going to take that, I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to take the noise reduction all the way off. I'm going to zoom in even more. Not exactly what zoom is going to do, but you can see that there's a lot of noise in this image. And shooting at 10,000, you would expect that. But it's remarkable what what software can do. So I'm going to bring this back to what its normal settings were, and take a look at that. Just by moving it there, it took all of that noise virtually totally out. So I'm very grateful for the noise reduction here. I'm going to go ahead and pull it a little bit more, and I'm going to take the smoothness and pull it a little bit more. Just that's going to help get rid of some of the splotchy areas that I may have had. And you can tell a good lens in the corners. I'm just going to point this out here, and I don't have necessarily the best lens. You can see in the corners here some of this. It's not pinpoint stars, and so I know that ahead of time. I didn't spend 1,000. I'm using my Tamron 24-70, so it's not a dedicated astro lens. If you're using a Zeiss or some of those fancy lenses, you can really get pinpoint stars all the way to the corner. A Sigma art lens, those have a great corner. So I know that in advance. So I'm gonna I know that, and so when I'm cropping, I'm usually going to crop somewhere in here. So I'm not going to use this part of the image anyway. So if you notice it's a little bit darker up here, the stars are elongated, that's okay. I'm going to crop it out anyway. So I'm okay with that. The solution is to get a better lens. Right now, I'm not in a position to do that. So just know that that's an option for you, that you don't have to use the whole image. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to zoom back out. All right. Once your noise is taken care of, I'm going to come back up to the basic panel here, and I'm a big fan of dehaze. Dehaze. Now, dehaze is going to it's going to thicken up the image. Now, that's one of the positive things that dehaze is going to do. It's going to thicken up your image. It's going to give more substance to the light there. One of the bad things is it's going to mess with your color temperatures. And so you need to then compensate here with changing your color temperature. So I'm going to bring that back up over here. In this case here, I want to bring my contrast up, and I'm going to compensate here again a little bit with my exposure. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, because I really want to pull out these tendrils that lead to antares here. This is looking good. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clean these up in Photoshop when I bring that into Photoshop. But notice my contrast here. I'm almost all the way over to the right, and it's still not as contrasty as I want it. And one of the benefits of bringing and editing a photo into Photoshop from Lightroom is that all of your settings start now at 0. So it uses these new settings as my base settings, and now I can add more contrast to that. And you'll see how that works over when I bring this into to Lightroom. Clarity is very helpful when it comes to your astrophotography. This is without the clarity. And the image is pretty small here. I'm going to bring it into here. Then I'm going to add some clarity to it. Clarity is a little bit, it will go a long ways when it comes to clarity. But that also, if you noticed here, I'm going to pull clarity all the way over to the right just for grins. It's going to blow part of the Milky Way out on the left-hand side there. So you got to watch out for that. And that's again why we brought our highlights down to manage that spot. You don't want that too bright over there. Go ahead and unmute yourself as you have questions or comments.
Yes, Bruce. What was your Kelvin reading or your white balance reading when you shot the photo originally?
I'm always shooting with just daylight.
Okay.
Since the sun is a star, and most of the things out there are stars, I find, and then you're shooting in RAW, you can move it around anyway. But it's usually daylight settings.
Thank you.
Yep. We have this haze that was going on. We had these clouds. We're looking south over the Salton Sea, and some clouds had set in, and they were capturing all the light from the valley below, right there. Now, sometimes that helps, sometimes that hurts, but you would think by the appearance of this picture that the Milky Way stops. That the Milky Way stops right here, and there's no more Milky Way. And that's actually not true. There's an entire other half of this thing that goes down. And if you live in the southern hemisphere, you can see that there's only half of it. So the closer you get to the equator and then further south, the more the Milky Way that you actually see. And this part over here, Antares, for us in the northern hemisphere, it's on the right. But down under, it shows up on the left. Everything is reversed. So so when I'm looking at astrophotography, I can tell which part of the world they are in. One, by how much of the Milky Way that I can see, and two, which way Antares is. So that's always interesting. Okay, so I've added some dehaze. I've looked at my exposure. I've edited my noise, and I'm going to mess with the colors just a little bit. What color is it supposed to be? Well, that is a really tough question, because you actually can't see this with your eyes. Now, I'm sure there is a scientific right answer to that, but I edit my Milky Ways to taste. And a lot of it is going to depend on how much light pollution you have. That'll depend on what color, what colors, what your foreground elements are. You can skew yellow, you can skew blue. A lot of people, I have Wayne Pinkerton. He's one of the guys I follow. He kind of skews purple. So I'm shooting the Milky Way as an artist, not necessarily as as somebody who's, I'm not documenting the exact colors of the universe over here. So this still isn't as dark as I want it to be, these tendrils. And I still have my satellite images in here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring those into Photoshop. So I have this at 2.
Before you go, Bruce, two things. When you were on 1:1 view,
Yes.
it looked like you had noise that you should move the luminance slider with. And I think in most Milky Way shots, you have to use luminance. And the other is try texture. That'll bring the stars out too.
Texture will bring the stars out. I find texture works best when it comes to people fit pictures. you move the texture a little bit away. In my case here, since I'm shooting at 6400 and I haven't blended, I haven't stacked any, texture actually brings out more noise than I like. So you said the luminance, there is some.
You go back down to
There you
luminance
go. I'm
and
back
try
on the
that.
details.
Do your 1-to-1 and look what the luminance may do.
Yep, it actually did help. So this is before, and this is after. So adding some luminance is a good idea. Thank you for that, John. Actually, John, you have just redone an entire Milky Way editing tutorial. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, about 3 years ago, I wrote a tutorial on the Milky Way, which is several pages long. And for this presentation tonight, I've updated it quite a bit because a lot of things have changed in Photoshop and Lightroom. And if anyone wants the tutorial, you can email me, and you can find my email address in the photogram. And at the very top where I say you need help, on the photogram in my section on different processing, you'll see my email address. So just email me that you would like the Milky Way tutorial, and I'll send it to you.
Awesome, John, thank you. And I had a chance to read it, and it's fantastic. I'm now going to do the blending part. And so I'm waiting for the computer to catch up. Here we go. I have my image that we just edited here on the right. And on the left, I have my ground that I'm going to shoot. And so I'm going to right mouse click on that, and I'm going to edit in layers in Photoshop. And this is going to open these up rather than two separate images. It's going to open it up as a layer in Photoshop. So that'll happen pretty quick here. While that's going, where's some of the darkest skies that you've shot in? Anybody shot in some dark skies?
Of course, we had a camera.
Death Valley has some really dark areas, and I like the Cottonwood area where you shot this series.
Yes, this unfortunately, Frank was on the south side, and so you don't have the mountains that you get once you get inside of the park. So I'm looking forward to going back there again.
Yeah.
It's fairly dark out in Trona.
Trona, yep, Trona Plenticles. I have that on my list, but haven't had a chance to shoot that yet. All right, my images are here in Photoshop, or I'm sorry, yeah, in Photoshop as layers. There's two layers. I'm going to turn off my the ground, and this is where, again, shooting something with a clean horizon is easier. It's much more difficult. This is where it's much more difficult if you're shooting in pine trees. This is a nice clean horizon. It just happens to be. I'm going to take my quick selection tool here in Photoshop. I have a relatively small brush size of 10, and I'm just going to run it right down the bottom. And you can see the blinky lines, and I'm going to run it up. And that's pretty much all I have to do here. You can see it's went ahead and selected most of the things for me. All I need to do is get this last little bit. I'm going to use my lasso tool. I'm using up here in the top. You can see I'm adding to the selection. And just by hand here, I'm going to come down and select an additional piece. All right, now I've selected my sky, and I'm going to make a mask out of that. And I'm going to go ahead. So I made a mask out of my sky. So that's where I want it. And I'm going to now bring that mask up here. to the top. And I'm going to show the image. I'm going to view the image. It's like, uh-oh, I did this backwards. So that's all right. I can go over here and I can double click on the mask and I can tell that mask to invert. Aha. And the mask is now inverted. Now there was we lost some things. There were some more mountains here. We lost that. The foreground and the background were taken at 2 different heights. And so I need to restore that. So in between the photo, here are my layers, between my mask and my photo, there is a lock tool. And I'm going to unlock my lock tool. And then I'm going to move my mask. No, I'm not going to move my mask. I'm going to move my photo. There we go. Now we're looking better. So that's looking good, but my Milky Way still has these satellite images into them. So I'm going to need to clean those up. So I'm going to select on my Milky Way layer, and I'm going to come over here to my healing brush, and I'm going to clean that up there. I'm going to clean up that there, and I'm going to clean that up there. And if you're dealing with your astrophotography guys, your real astronomy guys, you don't accidentally eliminate their favorite star cluster. they might get mad at you. So the star is cleaned up, but the sky, like I said, the sky is not. Looking at my composition here on the left-hand side, this bright spot here is bothering me a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and take my Milky Way and I'm going to tip it a bit. And I'm going to bring it down a little bit. And I can make this go bigger. And proportionally bigger there. And down just a little bit. Try to bring that up again. So for my eye and my composition, I'm liking that. I think that's good. But the image itself still needs a little more work. And so there's a couple ways to do this. One, you can add layer adjustments to your image. I prefer going right into Camera Raw. It's you can't undo it. It's a lossy editing technique. You got one undo and that's it. Once you say go, but I'm usually okay with that. I'm not too picky here. So remember, I said you're starting back at 0 again. So I can give more contrast to my image and really bring out those tendrils here in the Milky Way. So this area here, just by pulling up the contrast, is much more contrasty. And try bringing in the blacks. See what that happens there. Nope. How about my whites? A little bit. I like to bring up my whites a little bit.
Bruce,
Yep, go ahead.
I have a question. I don't use Camera Raw. Can you take that back to Lightroom and add contrast after you've done the work in Photoshop?
You sure can. The Camera Raw in Photoshop here, the Camera Raw editor part, it's exactly the same as Photoshop.
Right.
The exact same. But yes, you can add.
I thought, but I just wondered. I wanted to be sure.
Yep.
Thank you.
Remember that part that was going to blow out? Has a tendency to blow out is here. So I just went ahead and painted that, darkened it up just a little bit, made sure that it didn't blow out. And anything else I want to do here? While I'm here, I'm going to say okay to that. And that gave my, edited my Milky Way. So I'm happy with that. Now the road and the sky don't match. One is blue, one is yellow. So I'm going to need to do something with the road. And so I'm going to open up, I'm going to select the road layer, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go into Camera Raw Filter.
Bruce, if you switch the layer to a smart object, you can go into Camera Raw and you can readjust your settings.
Oh, handy. I'll have to learn about that. Maybe I should take your class one of these days. All right, so it's which I'm serious about that, because that sounds like a time-saving tool. So I'm going to bring some blue in. I'm going to add some black in there. I'm going to bring my exposure down, and I'm going to add some clarity. Because this is the road, I'm going to grid it up a little bit. That's going to make that yellow line stand out much better. So let me go ahead and say okay on that. And let's see, that's going to pop up. Yeah, I like that. I like that better. It's not dark enough though, so I'm going to go back in there. Camera Raw Filter. I need it darker. I'll take the exposure. There we go. I'm also going to take the highlights down. There we go. So that's good. And then I'm going to take, actually, I'm going to go ahead and stretch this. I want it to curve more. So I'm going to bring that up here. And now I'm just going to clean it up a little bit. To my eye, these are distracting. So I'm going to use the heel brush and get rid of them. These light poles. These reflector lights. Going to get rid of those. Oh, I got a hot pixel here. I need to clean up. I'm going to get a smaller brush for that. Bring that down. Clean that up. Get it. Come on, get it. Boom. Get that over here. There's this rock over here. Again, it's snagging my eye when I'm looking at it. So now I'm just going to go through these rocks over here. Some of these are just in the way. So I'm going to clean those up. Just getting rid of the distractions that are going to keep the eye from flowing up that road to the Milky Way. Get that done, get that done, get that done. And a couple more here. I'm just healing those up. And then last thing to do is crop. So I'm going to crop down. Oops. I'm going to crop
Bruce,
down.
a quick question.
Go ahead.
When you're using that healing tool, is it doing a content aware type thing?
Yep, it's a AI. John, how would you describe it? But yes, it is. And so notice on my my tool here, I'm using the rule of thirds. It's going to just touch the top of the mountain. My favorite part of the Milky Way here is that the Rojos. So I'm going to make sure that that is in there. My bottom point where my start is, where that yellow line is right in the middle. And so that's going to bring my eye over here. It's going to come right into the Milky Way. So whether I'm looking down and going up or up and going down, I have my finished composition there. So
Bruce,
that,
I always hate the light pollution. It seems to draw my eye first. Do you do anything to reduce that?
well, you got a couple of options. In this case here, I think it goes well. You can get a lot less light pollution just by moving the Milky Way down. That is a very legitimate thing to do in my kind of editing. If it's totally bothering you, just set it right there. Now you have no light pollution whatsoever. In my case here, I don't think that I like it with it. I think it adds a band of color and a little bit of interest. But that's, again, you're going to edit to taste. This is what makes the world go round. But really, you can't do much with it. You can't. There's not a lot that you can do. If it's there in your image, it's there in your image. So that wraps up what I had to share with you this evening. What questions do you have for me?
Hey, Bruce, when you talked about the rojos,
Yep.
about changing the colors on the first image that you went there, how did you actually get the color to come in that from it being so faded?
That's where I did some stacking. So I took 10 images and blended them together. It got more and more color it accumulates. Light is cumulative. So as you add more seconds and minutes to light, it's adding. It's the same thing. So if you take a 30-second image and another 30-second image, that's the equivalent of a full minute. The problem is what happens when you're shooting the stars is you take 30 seconds in one location, and by the time you take your second shot, you take another 30 seconds, it's over here. So the concept behind blending is it takes this star and it adds it on top of that star. And so it then is able to take that as a full minute worth of capture. So you can do that two ways. One is using a star tracker, and so that's going to move your camera, and it's going to keep that one star in place as it moves throughout the sky. So your camera lens is here, and it's pointing, and it's going to turn as the star moves across the sky. That's one way, is using a star tracker. The other way is to stack. And that's a whole different, like I said earlier, if you're talking about levels, tracking and stacking, that's another level. That would be a 201 class.
Bruce?
Yes, Ann.
Yeah, so I just wanted to thank you for the piece about editing to taste. I think when I first started doing the Milky Way, we did a Joshua Tree, and I went to Trona as well. Because I think I was new to it, I really had a lot of struggle about what color the sky is supposed to be. Is it supposed to be blue, purple? And, I don't have that issue with other things so much. I'm more creative, but it felt like there was a right or a wrong way to do that for the night sky. So I really appreciate what you're saying, because you can be creative and see what you like with this. And I think I was just restricting myself a little bit.
Well, thank you. I agree that it's definitely can be, especially when you're doing everything, you want to get it right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason why you shouldn't get it right. So that's all I had to. That's the end of my programming. I'm happy to stay later and answer questions for you, or let people just shoot the breeze. But thank you so much for sticking with me. And grateful.
Thank you very much for the
opportunity.
program. It's very good.
Great program, Bruce.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You are welcome. So go out and shoot.
For your time and effort.
So Bruce, I have a question.
Hit me.
Okay. Like Ann asked, what is the true color of the Milky Way? And I know with all the stuff we got going on, and I've seen so many different ways that people have adjusted their color in the Milky Way to be so vastly different.
Yeah.
But is there really a kind of real color that the Milky Way should have?
There is one guy on the internet. If you Google what color is the Milky Way, there's one guy whose name will show up a lot, and he's pretty insistent that there is a right way to edit the Milky Way. He's pretty insistent, and he makes a good scientific case for it. This here is a stacked image of that same image. This is 30 images blended together. And so it's a little bit deeper. There's less noise. You can see the colors are richer. I was able to get a little bit more detail here in terms of the contrast of the tendrils here, more contrast in the mids. So there are, again, when you use some advanced techniques, you can definitely have some fun with it.
Bruce, I nominate you to do all the programs in the future.
Well, we have a great committee for that, and I'm looking forward to, and I'm on it, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they, what we come up with as a team, because there's a lot of talent in this group alone. This was my the final image using my blended. So it's a little bit more purpley, as you can tell. But again, and I used that same technique to move the road over there. So I was real pleased with it. This again, going back to my dental floss, I think that was the biggest thrill of the night.
I like the way it makes some of the stars or planets pop. I
Yeah,
thought that was pretty good.
It sure does. And again, this was a tracked image, and just trying to figure out how much tracking you can go with it. So again, when you're shooting, right out of the camera, you're not seeing much in terms of the Milky Way. You can see that it's there. It's a 30-second image. This is shooting at 6400 for 14 seconds, so not a lot of time. I was just trying to maximize, just seeing what I could get. It was all about it. I just wanted to experiment. So I think at night, when you're actually seeing the Milky Way, this is what it looks like to your naked eye. That I find this is what it looks like at night. And so you kind of see, well, there's something there, but your eye can't capture it. And that's when it's a long exposure. And make sure you pick up John's tutorial. It's fantastic. It kind of goes through a little bit more detail in terms of what some of these items do, some of the settings. But I'm editing your Milky Way just like you're editing anything else. This is where I'm shooting my flats or my darks. So instead of having long noise exposure on, where I'm taking a 30-second picture and then then the camera takes another 30-second picture and blends the two together to reduce noise, you can do that afterwards. So, and that helps because remember, if you're trying to, especially if you're stacking, if the stars are close together, it's easier for the software. But if you have to take a picture, wait another 30 seconds, take another picture, the software has to work a whole lot harder, and you get better results when you're stacking. Let me stop. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. See who's here. Hey, Oliver, glad you're able to join us. Oliver is a friend I met. We actually didn't meet at Death Valley, but how you doing?
Good, good. Sorry I'm late. Got
Hey.
caught up in some work.
So Oliver helped me practice. He was my guinea pig in terms of working through my process. So great to have you.
Good, good. I got a private lesson yesterday, so I was a
There
lucky
you
one.
go. So it's interesting, in terms of prepping for one of these things. I edited the star trails at least half a dozen times practicing yesterday, and I practiced editing the Milky Way at least a dozen times, just to get the workflow down, to make sure that you want to make it look easy for people who are watching, and that's. But if somebody makes it look easy, you know that a ton of time has gone into it. It's like the Olympic skater, right? They're just making their and they're just jumping and doing their twirls, and they make it look so easy. But that's a boatload of time has gone into that to master the craft. Hey, Dave Fickey, I see you there.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
I'm still here. This is stuff all brand new to me.
Pete, you learn a thing or two?
More than I could ever remember, I think.
So the question is, you actually have to go out and shoot it. And we're hitting, this is, the timing for this class, that was one of the ideas that Russ had, was to make sure that, people had it, were inspired, and then could go out and do it. But, and we're hitting peak Milky Way season here come June, July. And so I say if you can't shoot it in your driveway, you can't shoot it in Joshua Tree. Now, you may not be able to get the Milky Way in your driveway, but you can go through the motions. You can go outside, you can set up your tripod, you can make sure your intervalometer is working, you can make sure that that you can see in the dark, you can try your headlamps, you can make sure that all of your equipment is working, so that there's no surprises out in the field. And so that's a good way to practice, just right there in your driveway. Take all your equipment, set it up in the driveway, make sure all the lights are out, just like you're in the field, so you can know your camera. Learn to where your settings are, so when you're in the dark, it's not frustrating. Because if you haven't practiced and you're not familiar with your camera settings, and you go out in Joshua Tree, you'll waste half the night being frustrated at yourself for not knowing your gear, and which will make for a much less pleasing experience. So the moon is a great chance. The moon is a great thing to practice on. Again, just shooting, learning. Remember, step 1, step 2, step 3. That's a good baby step. It's nice and large. It's in the sky. You can't miss it. Shoot a full moon, and that is a good preparation for shooting the Milky Way.